What if the greatest empire the world had ever seen didn't fall with a bang, but with a whimper? For centuries, Rome stood unconquerable. Its legions were the stuff of legend, its aqueducts a marvel of engineering, its laws the foundation of Western civilization. When we picture its end, we imagine fire and blood. We see barbarian hordes, led by savage kings, tearing down the gates. We imagine a final, epic battle for the soul of the world. But the history books have a different, quieter, and far more terrifying story to tell. The true demise of Rome wasn't a single, spectacular event. It wasn't a murder. It was a suicide by 1,000 cuts. A silent, insidious decay was eating away at its core, a rot from within that sealed its fate long before the final barbarian blow. Join us as we uncover the hidden story of Rome's last century, the story of a giant collapsing under its own impossible weight. To understand the fall of Rome, we must first understand that by its final century, there wasn't one Rome, there were two. In 330 AD, Constantine had founded a new capital in the east, Constantinople. This new Rome was a fortress. It was wealthy, strategically placed on global trade routes, and possessed a vibrant economy and a loyal professional bureaucracy. The West was a different story. The old capital, Rome, was a symbolic relic. The real Western capital had become a small, swamp-protected fortress town called Ravenna. The Western Empire was overextended, underfunded, and facing enemies on every border. It was an empire living on borrowed time and a hollowed-out reputation. And the first and most critical rot was in the very thing that had built the empire, its army. The Roman legion of legend, the disciplined, short sword-wielding citizen soldier, was long dead. By the late 4th century, Roman citizens didn't want to serve. The army was a brutal, low-paying, and high-risk career. So who filled the ranks? Barbarians. The Romans had adopted a policy of using foederati, allied tribes, mostly Goths, Franks, and Alemanni, who were hired en masse to defend the borders. They fought for Rome, but they were not of Rome. They were led by their own chieftains, spoke their own languages, and worshipped their own gods. This barbarization of the army created a fatal weakness. These soldiers had no loyalty to the abstract concept of the Roman state. Their loyalty was to their general, the man who guaranteed their paycheck and promised them land. The Roman army wasn't a shield wall anymore. It was a sieve. While the army was decaying, an even more insidious rot was eating away at the empire's bones: the economy. If you truly want to know why Rome fell, don't look at a sword. Look at a tax ledger. For centuries, Rome had funded its massive army and sprawling bureaucracy through two things: conquest, plunder and new slaves, and taxes. By the 4th century, the conquests had stopped. The empire was on the defensive. That left only one source of income: taxes. And the tax system was monumentally, apocalyptically broken. The system worked like this. The super-rich, the senatorial class, who owned vast estates called latifundia, used their political influence to get themselves declared tax-exempt. They lived in unimaginable luxury, hoarding the empire's wealth in their fortified country villas, which were essentially private kingdoms. So who paid for everything? The curales, the middle class. The curales were the local city councilmen, the shop owners, the small-time landowners. They were responsible for collecting the taxes in their town. But here was the horrifying catch. If the collectors couldn't meet the government's insane, arbitrary quota, perhaps because of a bad harvest or a plague, they had to pay the difference out of their own pockets. It was a death sentence for the middle class. Thousands were bankrupted. They abandoned their homes, their cities, and their civic duties, fleeing to the countryside to become bandits, or worse, to beg for protection from the very same super-rich senators who had evaded taxes in the first place. This created a new class of people, the coloni, or tenant farmers. They weren't slaves, but they weren't free. They were legally tied to the land they worked, forbidden to leave. In essence, they were the first serfs of the Middle Ages. The Roman Empire had destroyed its own middle class, strangling the very people who ran its cities and paid for its army. At the same time, the currency itself was collapsing. Emperors, desperate for cash to pay their foederati armies, kept debasing the coinage. They melted down silver coins, mixed them with copper and tin, and minted twice as many. The people weren't stupid. They knew the new coins were worthless. This led to hyperinflation. Prices for wheat, oil, and wine skyrocketed by thousands of %. Soon, no one would accept money at all. The sophisticated continent-spanning Roman economy, its greatest achievement, ground to a halt and reverted to a primitive system of barter. You can't pay an army of 50,000 men with chickens. You can't run an empire on barter. And then came the killing blow. It wasn't a battle. It was a logistical nightmare. In 439 AD, a barbarian tribe called the Vandals, led by their brilliant king Gaiseric, did the unthinkable. They built a fleet, crossed from Spain to North Africa, and captured the port of Carthage. Why was this so devastating? North Africa was Rome's breadbasket. It was the personal brain supply for the city of Rome and its armies. The Vandals didn't just conquer North Africa, they kept it. They seized the latifundia and the grain ships. In one move, Gaiseric had his hand on the jugular vein of the Western Empire. He could, and did, starve Rome at will. The rot in the bones, economic collapse, was now complete. The empire was bankrupt, starving, and broken.
Their entire political careers were not spent governing the empire, but in a constant, bloody civil war against each other. The Roman army's last decades were not spent fighting barbarians. They were spent fighting other Romans. A foederati army of Goths, loyal to one general, would be marched against a foederati army of Franks, loyal to another, all to decide who got to control the boy emperor in Ravenna. This political paralysis produced one of the most infamous moments in Roman history. In 410 AD, the Visigothic king Alaric marched his army to the gates of Rome. But Alaric didn't want to destroy Rome. He was a Roman general. He had fought for the empire. He simply wanted what all generals wanted: back pay, food for his men, and land to settle them on. He was, in effect, a union boss demanding a fair contract. The imperial government in Ravenna, paranoid and incompetent, refused. So Alaric, in a fit of rage, did the unthinkable. He sacked the city. For 3 days, his troops plundered the ancient capital. The psychological shock was profound. For the first time in 800 years, the eternal city had fallen. And where was the emperor, Honorius? The story goes that when a messenger ran to him in Ravenna, shouting, "Rome has perished!" Honorius was horrified. He thought the messenger was talking about his favorite pet chicken, whom he had named Roma. When told it was only the city of Rome that had fallen, he was relieved, saying, "But I just fed her." The story is probably propaganda, but it reveals a deeper truth. The leaders of Rome were disconnected, decadent, and more concerned with their pets than their empire. This was the rot in the head. The brain was dead. The body was just waiting to fall. So now, and only now, can we talk about the barbarians. The popular story is that they were a savage, overwhelming tide that destroyed civilization. The truth is that they were a symptom, not the cause. They were simply the final gust of wind that toppled a house already eaten hollow by termites. For centuries, Rome had expertly played a game of divide and conquer. But now the tables had turned. The Goths, Franks, and Vandals had spent a century inside the empire. They had learned Roman tactics, they understood Roman politics, and they saw firsthand just how weak and divided their masters had become. The invasions we read about were rarely invasions in the modern sense. They were migrations, and often they were simply civil wars. Alaric's sack of Rome in 410 AD? It was a wage dispute that got out of hand. After his men plundered the city, Alaric simply marched them south, hoping to find land in Africa. He died of a fever a few months later. The second sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455, they were invited. The Roman Empress Eudoxia, to get revenge on a rival who had murdered her husband, sent a message to the Vandal king Gaiseric, asking him to come to Rome. He happily obliged, and his men looted the city for 2 weeks. It was a political move, orchestrated from within. What about the most terrifying barbarian of all, Attila the Hun? In 451 AD, Attila invaded Gaul, and he was met by the last great Roman general, Aetius, at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. This is often portrayed as Rome versus the barbarians, the battle for civilization. But who was in Aetius's army? Almost no Romans. His main fighting force was a massive contingent of Visigoths, Franks, and Alans. It was a barbarian army, led by a Roman fighting another barbarian. Aetius won the battle, saving the West. And what was his reward? His reward was assassination. The paranoid, pathetic emperor, Valentinian III, jealous of Aetius's fame, stabbed him to death with his own hands in 454 AD. A year later, the emperor himself was assassinated by Aetius's supporters. This is the internal decay. This is the rot. Every time a strong leader emerged who could have saved the empire, he was cut down by the internal political sickness. The empire was actively destroying its own immune system. We now arrive at the end, the year 476 AD. By this point, the Western Roman Empire was a joke. It consisted of Italy and not much else. The emperor was a 16-year-old boy named Romulus Augustulus. His name was a pathetic echo of Rome's founder, Romulus, and its first greatest emperor, Augustus. They called him the Little Emperor. He was a puppet, placed on the throne by his father, the Magister Militarum Orestes. But the Foederati army, the mixed barbarian troops stationed in Italy, had had enough. They were tired of broken promises of land and pay. Their leader, a general in the Roman army named Odoacer, confronted Orestes. He demanded 1/3 of all land in Italy for his men. Orestes refused. Odoacer's men hunted Orestes down and killed him. Then Odoacer marched into Ravenna and walked into the throne room. There was no grand battle, no siege, no fire. The city gates were just opened. Odoacer approached the boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus. He did not kill him, he did not torture him. He saw a child in purple robe sitting on a throne that meant nothing. Odoacer simply pensioned him off. He gave the boy a generous retirement package and sent him to live in a nice villa in the countryside. Then Odoacer did something that perfectly captures the whimper of Rome's end. He gathered the imperial regalia, the purple robes, the diadem, the symbols of Western power. He put them in a box, and he mailed them to the other Roman emperor, Zeno, in Constantinople. The message, translated, was simple. The West no longer needs an emperor. And that was it. No one at the time even registered it as the fall of the Roman Empire. It was just another Tuesday, another barbarian general had taken over. The lights hadn't gone out, the Dark Ages didn't immediately begin. It was just an administrative change, a line item veto, a company finally declaring bankruptcy after being insolvent for 100 years. The Western Roman Empire, the greatest political and military power the world had ever known, ended its life not with the bang of a legion's shield wall, but with a retirement package and a postage stamp.
Ever feel like something's slowly crumbling around you? Not with a sudden disaster, but a gradual, unnoticed decay. That's the true, terrifying lesson of Rome's fall. It wasn't the barbarian at the gate that delivered the killing blow. It was the barbarian within. It was the hollowing out of the middle class. It was the super-rich hoarding all the wealth and paying no taxes. It was a government that became so paranoid and gridlocked that it assassinated its own best generals. It was a military that lost its common identity and fought only for a paycheck. It was the slow, creeping apathy of a public that no longer believed in the idea of Rome. Rome's story is a warning, etched in stone and time. It shows us that empires are fragile. It shows us that the most profound threats are rarely the ones we see coming. They are the quiet, internal erosions we choose to ignore, the slow rot in the foundations, the decay in the heart that continues day after day until the entire magnificent structure, which once seemed eternal, finally collapses into dust.